Hey everyone, welcome to our weekly live broadcast. Today we are happy to host Dan Maycock of Loftus Labs to talk about AgTech. And so without further ado, Dan, would you like to introduce yourself with some background?
Sure. My name is Dan Maycock. Thanks for having me. I'm the VP of IT and Data at Loftus Ranches, and also one of the principals of Loftus Labs, which is a company focused around doing data consulting for the ag industry. My background is I grew up in ag, Prosser, Eastern Washington. Went to WSU, moved to Seattle, lived there about 15 years, worked for Boeing, Amazon, did a couple tech startups, worked in consulting at Capgemini and Solemn. And then had the family, had the kids, decided to move back home, and found a great opportunity to take my years of experience in data and analytics and apply it to the ag industry, where I've been in the last 3 years. And just recently worked with a number of really smart people to launch Loftus Labs. So also the ag IPZ guy here with the 5G Open Innovation Lab, and working with great people there too. So appreciate you having me today to talk about ag and 5G.
Of course, and we appreciate your time as well. What you'll guys find in the next less than an hour that we have with Dan is that there's many layers to Dan. What he didn't throw in there is that as part of his efforts in consulting, he actually did a lot of innovation consulting for large companies. And maybe Dan, we can touch on that later on in today's call. And actually even wrote a book about that sort of thing. So there's many talents that Dan's bringing to the table and lots of things for us to learn. So with that, let's start off, Dan, with your early sort of career and why you've been spending so much time recently in ag tech. You had grown up in Eastern Washington, and then kind of moved to this side of the mountains here in the Seattle area, and then eventually have moved back.
Yep.
Ag is a fantastic industry, been around for generations, important to our obviously our health and our well-being, but it's an industry that's been quite underserved from a technology perspective. What gets you really excited about this space?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about agriculture is the oldest industry in the world. Obviously, it all started, it's biblical, right? Cain and Abel and the Garden of Eden, right? Genesis, man was created to tend to the land. So it's about as old as it gets. But when you talk about where it is as a culture, because ag largely exists in rural America, it's not in an urban area. It's not attracting hot young talent starting tech jobs. It tends to get overlooked in a lot of ways. Socioeconomically, rural communities in general tend to be 10 to 15 years behind. And so because the venture capital focuses on what moves quickly, tech companies tend to glom onto those areas. People like living in urban areas where a lot of exciting things are happening. Rural communities tend to not be hotbeds of innovation and technology. The interesting thing is, though, there's nothing else that really touches everyone's lives, typically three times a day. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner is in the ag space. There's nothing that's as prolific and works its way through the society as much as food. Brings people together. Farm to table movements, organic food movements, sustainability movements all tie around agriculture. So though it's underserved and not looked at in the most innovative way, it's nothing more impactful short of, getting water every day that affects pretty much everyone in the world. It ties us all together, something we all have in common, our interests around food, how we bring societies, bringing people together is around food, but also how we sustain healthy people. Food is health, and we spend trillions of dollars a year on healthcare. Doctors would say a large part of that is bad nutrition, bad food choices, processed food. So as we get smarter with technology around ag, we make ag more sustainable, we make it more accessible. We fix things like food deserts where people have a complete lack of access to it. We create better systems to create healthy food, so we're not all, eating Tyson chicken 3 meals a day. We'll also look to technologies like Impossible, who's literally working to completely eliminate animal agriculture because we're getting past a stretching point on that. Not to mention the impacts around climate change. Ag is the greatest absorber of carbon. The more green space I have within agriculture, the healthier those plants are, the more it sucks carbon out of the atmosphere and actually helps global warming quite a bit. Kind of anti-urbanization. We see a lot of interesting ag innovations around hydroponics, indoor farming, on everything from cannabis now being legal in several states to being able to grow cruciferous vegetables in Detroit so you don't have to ship everything as far. It touches not only all parts of society, but incorporates everything from physics and science to biology, to a state-of-the-art technology around machine learning and drones.
Hmm.
So it is a fascinating space, but the fact that as a whole, it's several years behind everyone else gives me excited to be able to help catch it up, which got me excited in 5G Open Innovation Lab, bringing something like 5G to agriculture. It will do so much to lay a good foundation to catch everyone up. There's 300 commodity types in the state. It's $38 billion industry in whole. Tree fruit, 28% of our state. Several hundred of those are family-owned farms. So also keeping everything from being consolidated and industrialized. The ultimate entrepreneur is a farmer, having anything from 40 acres, 500 acres, thousands of acres, still family-owned in a lot of places. A lot of people I deal with in the ag industry, I work for a fourth generation family farm. So it's also a source of income. Yakima has 114 nonprofits, largely funded by agriculture. Privately held family farms build schools, contribute to Rotary, do all kinds of things for communities. In areas like Trent, Michigan, where we see GM setting up and leaving, and the decimation of those communities, that doesn't happen in ag communities as long as we keep family farms farming and pouring back into the community. The profit stays in the area, right? So it's
Yeah.
even more important than ever before. Not to mention, the 10 years we supposedly have based on science around stopping climate change to really dive into ag, be a part of the conversation around food, around sustainability, around the environment, all things which touch the agricultural industry.
So Dan, on the point you made earlier, being one of the oldest industry here, and clearly important to our well-being. AgTech is sort of an umbrella term to refer to a bunch of different innovations. But as Kurt and I were out visiting you, over a month and a half ago in Eastern Washington, it seems like there's pockets of innovation that's happening, but nothing really that's connected, right? For instance, on the supply chain and processing side for tree fruit, that's highly automated, but there's still very much a big dependency on labor. And Steve, I know you know this quite well from Innovate Ag, and little adoption of real technology there. So if you were to take a macro view down of the industry, given that there's a bit of a broken chain there in terms of where innovation is happening, what's your perspective on sort of the here and now areas that really could benefit from having more innovation available? What are some of the impediments that you're seeing as well?
Yeah, so when you kind of talk about ag as a whole, you really break things into what's called row crops or annual crops, and then everyone else. So row crops, wheat, corn, soy, sorghum, large crops, right? Entire states in the Midwest are made entirely of row crops, flower states, right? That largely drive a lot of the ag conversation. Type in ag in Google search, you're going to see pictures of farmers and John Deere tractors looking at wheat, right? Wheat and corn tend to drive most of the conversation around ag. That's where you get the bulk of the crop nationally. It's where most of the farm bills dedicated from the USDA every year. And that's where a lot of the tech innovation goes because it's low hanging fruit to go after. As to the John Deeres and Monsantos of the world, there are a couple of very large companies like Wonderful and Driscoll's that have enough scale and size to really innovate within specialty crops, or Gallo on the wine side. But for everyone else, the thousands of farmers around the world, they're left largely up to themselves to be innovative. And within given commodity types, no one is big enough to draw enough interest from the broader ag tech community. So things like the tree fruit industry, which for us is 3 billion a year, it's about 28% of the state's total agriculture output. It's really tricky because it's trees, large canopies, hard terrains, bad connectivity. And for a company like John Deere to want to innovate that space, it just frankly isn't big enough. As big as it is, isn't big enough to compete with the attention of wheat and corn. So a lot of those folks get left behind, but are essential to our human diet, essential to exports. We export apples, Washington State, to 45 different countries around the world. Being a part of that conversation around tree fruit and all the things that you can grow on trees, right? Bringing us in connectivity with other states. We mostly grow apples here. We also do them in New York, Michigan, other small buckets. But for us, tree fruit's a really big deal in the state, even if it isn't as big of a deal nationally. So finding ag tech vendors that want to be able to solve tricky problems within tree fruit, we do see there's a lot of things that overlap, whether it's hops or wine grapes. We all care about irrigation, finding solutions that cross pollinate across different types of crop types, where we can have centers where people come together and discuss these different issues. Largely, in and of itself, the ag industry tends to be very siloed in its own commodity type. So, seed crop folks aren't talking to wine folks, aren't talking to apple folks, a large part why the ag IPZ should exist to bring these people together. But as I am a tech innovator going out and raising venture capital, my total addressable market, obviously, focusing too much on a given crop for too long, I'm not going to have enough scale to grow past a certain point. So being able to build solutions that do have applications across different types of crops, bringing those conversations together is a really big deal as well. But as I continue to innovate and draw folks to rural America, not only am I creating more of a Silicon Orchard and getting more tech people involved, keeping people local that want to have jobs. It's going to put manual laborers and immigrants, give them high paying jobs to get involved in data analytics and programming, helps improve the economy, helps keep these ag businesses in business, but also spurs new ideas around sustainable farming, food practices, which help solve a lot of our national issues. All we have to do is look at COVID to see how fragile our supply chain is today around the food that we grow and what we eat. And the only way we're going to solve that is with tech companies getting involved in the conversation, innovating in areas outside of row crops specifically, and trying to drive new ideas into the industry across the other 295 commodity types here in Washington State and abroad.
Hmm. So one of the big impediments, though, for innovation really happen, though, is in connectivity, correct?
Yeah,
Just the
absolutely.
ability to actually access a stable data connectivity network is holding a lot of these farmers back.
Yeah, if I drive to multiple parts of the state, I get zero cell phone connectivity. I was the CIO of a large apple grower in Mattawa. No carrier supplies coverage at all, to the point we actually had to buy a fixed wireless system, install it ourselves, just to get a cell phone signal from anyone out. In case someone hurt themselves, we'd have to drive 20 minutes just to reach 911 because landlines weren't going out that far, obviously, but literally complete entire dead spots in the state. It's not only a self safety and health risk, but how am I supposed to innovate in those pockets where I have zero connectivity at all? So it's a huge issue. Even as we've had 30 or 40 years of wireless connectivity, ubiquitous connectivity, towers. A lot of those towers only follow roads and don't go off the beaten path where a lot of these farms exist. So it's a huge impediment around connectivity and far too costly to roll fiber to all parts of the state. So our real answer is to be able to drive more 5G options out into places like Mattawa.
Now, when Kurt and I were out in the field with you and Steve and others, we had met with one of the growers who had mentioned that there was, some real things they could do with the data they're able to collect from their growing operations. But unlike most industries where there's a pretty quick cause and effect, right? You do something and you see that play out in the product development cycle or what have you. With certain crops and with just growing in general, keep me honest on this. Uh, Not making the right decisions early in the growing season could lead to not so great outcomes as when it comes time to harvest.
Yep.
And so I would venture to say that in this industry specifically, access to data that helps growers make informed decisions early on in their growing season could really make a huge material impact to their harvest longer term.
Yeah, I'll talk about three different kind of stages where data could have a huge impact on growing.
Okay.
The first is starts. So I put a tree in the ground, I have a rootstock. I'm going to graft the tree onto that. That tree, the new tree, the grafted tree, it could take several years to mature. So if I make a theoretically bad decision with my soil, with my moisture content early on, the tree might not either grow to its full extent, might be prone to certain kind of diseases, might die before it ever hits maturity. That could be a 5 to 7 year decision, right? If I'm making longer term bets around how to be able to work on that particular tree. We don't see that as common as we do other issues around things like pruning. Every year, how much fruit do I want to grow in a tree? Trees, typically apple trees, have bumper crops. They grow a lot one year, grow less the next. So to be able to create an even distribution where the trees are always growing the same amount of fruit every year, where it's grown, how it's grown, where it lives, what kind of soil, what kind of topography, how the water table works, all affects that given tree. But because I don't have affordable enough technology, I make decisions perhaps 50 acres at a time. Rather than dialing in each tree, I have to make broad sweeping decisions. Well, I may spend too much on labor that year because of that. I may prune too hard and not get enough fruit. Or if I have too much fruit, I actually get smaller fruit. Rather than less apples that grow bigger, a tree only has so much vigor or energy. So, how I tune that tree up throughout the year can have an impact on what my overall yield is. The third big decision as prices get set with major retailers in August. My harvest isn't until September, October, November. So I may have an oversized crop and I may have prices that deflate that. I may think I'm getting too many apples. Prices are set at 150 million bins. I may only have 130 million bins. 20 million bins less, I'm not necessarily getting paid anymore. All the rates or FOB prices have already been negotiated. So at various places, I can make strategic errors around how I adjust my data. I can't pivot overnight. It could be several years worth of decisions. It could be several months. It could be an entire season lost because I don't have the right data and information in front of me as a grower, a packer, or a shipper, or a sales desk to be able to make the right decisions. And if one bad year goes through and a farmer has to go out of business, creates consolidation, private equity gets involved at that point, and it just degrades the community. So it is a huge deal to have the right data available at the right times holistically, combining multiple different kinds of data points per acre so I can make the best decisions possible as an agribusiness.
So on one hand, so thanks for that, Dan. On one hand, having access to data helps farmers or growers make the right decisions early on in their crop season, and eventually, hopefully, lead to better outcomes in the harvest. But there's also an argument to be made that access to that data throughout the whole growing process helps them not have to overcompensate, whether it's through overcompensating on irrigation, overcompensating on chemical usage, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And today, farmers are doing that to help to at least shore up some of the risk they have in their growth. And that one particular grower that we had spent some time with in Eastern Washington was suggesting that they were dropping pretty significant amounts of funding every month on chemicals. Would you like to share that story with folks?
Yeah, so I use chemicals, fumigation, whether it's pests, whether it's chemical thinning, to adjust the tree along the way. If hypothetically, as the tree's starting to bud the first time or grow leaves, right? How I thin the leaves, how I thin the tree early on, I may have 7 waves of impact across that tree, given between when it starts to develop leaves early on to when it actually grows. And I make estimates around things like how many buds are going to turn into leaves versus blossoms. Blossoms turn into apples. So how much am I going to grow? I'm making estimates, a lot of educated guesswork around that. And if I guess wrong and I have too many apples, I have to compensate for that by either doing very aggressive manual interventions, a lot of labor, a lot of piece rates, a lot of cost out the door, or I'm spending money on chemicals to compensate for that to get this cheese dialed in later in the year. I'm also forecasting and making a lot of decisions about how many people do I need in my labor pool? How many H2A workers do I have? Do I have enough to perform harvest? More importantly, if I hire too many people, can I afford to bring the fruit to market if the price is at the wrong rate? All of that's figured out retroactively and not up front. So the sooner I can get data dialed in and all throughout the year make the right decisions, if I send folks to go prune a tree, does that tree even need to be pruned at all? Do I have that dialed in where it needs to be? And the smarter I get down to the tree versus, the 50-acre block, the better decisions I make, the less I spend on labor because it's more dialed in around true precision ag, the less I spend on chemicals because I'm only spot applying what I need to, the less I spend on compensating later on in the season and kind of spending more when there's a rush to push things out the door before harvest.
Yeah.
And it's just more of a balanced equilibrium at that point throughout the year. But that's really the goal, is get down to the tree. I mean, there's not a sensor that's affordable enough yet to get every tree kind of dialed in around that particular vigor. We're working on it. But where we can leverage advanced technologies, machine learning, and those sorts of things, dialed in with better connectivity with 5G, in a world where all my trees could get to the point I could hold up a augmented reality device to know what does this particular tree need on this day. And if it doesn't need the work, skip it to the next one versus just sending waves of labor, waves of chemicals, waves of resources through to hopefully get most of the fruit to where I want it to go. using selective sampling at this point.
So there's arguably there's money on the table by growers today in terms of overcompensating to hit, to hit quality harvest at the end of a growing season. And you could address a better capability around that harvest with technology and access to data that lessens their dependencies on other means, whether it's irrigation, chemicals, labor, whatever it ends up becoming,
Yeah.
ultimately better.
There's a real misnomer in the tech community as I talk to friends in Seattle about how much money is really within ag, right? Is it big enough total addressable market to justify going down and really solving these problems? And we're talking about family owned farms with one or two decision makers running a $150 million operation. It doesn't take too many customers like that to get your company off the ground. And if we look across the state, where I can apply technology to more and more types of crops, I'm in the billions of dollars. I mean, a single apple grower and packer could be $1 billion+, and that's just within Washington State. I go to California, Wonderful alone spends 100 million a year on just marketing. Imagine what they spend on irrigation and technology problems. Driscoll supplies berries all over the world. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry with revenue in every state in the U.S. As far as I know, it's the only vertical that has strong representation in every single one of our 50 states. And then globally, no country goes without it. So the opportunity to get into ag is potentially limitless. And we don't hear about it. It's not as sexy of an industry. I'm not working for Amazon and making ridiculous money or building another tech product to go after Marcom or kind of a sexier vertical. But given it's so underserved and behind, and there's a real need to catch up as something we all depend on, it's not a vertical that's going away. And it's really underserved. So it's more than ample opportunity for any tech company to really build an ag vertical or an ag solution.
On the misnomer piece, one of the areas that I'd love for you to touch on and provide your perspectives for us, Dan, is there is a misunderstanding about how important access to technology is to growers. But because of, let's say, the lack of connectivity or the infrastructure means and all the other fun stuff, they really haven't and been able to. And so, from the small subset of growers that I've had a chance to meet with, there's a high aptitude to embrace more and more technology. It ultimately helps them become more efficient and make smart decisions. But there's that gap. From your standpoint, given how deeply connected you are in Eastern Washington to the various communities of growers there, is that a true statement? Is it, that farmers absolutely want to embrace technology, and in fact, they're turning more to it as a way to be more efficient at what they do?
Absolutely. Ag has always been technology driven to some extent.
Yeah,
It's just generations of technology. I mean, think about what really prompted the what they say industrial revolution around technology, railroads. Those railroads were transporting crops, right? Back in Britain, to be able to get food around. The cotton gin was an early form of technology. Eli Whitney, right? Early form of innovation in agriculture. Cotton's a crop. We look at where Excel is being used. Ag is one of Dell's largest customers in terms of terminals, handsets, ruggedization, drives all kinds of investment from companies from Simplot and Cargill, some of the largest ag companies in the world, down to 50-acre farms being able to leverage technology to track and sort through. The Farmer's Almanac is the oldest piece of data forecasting, data analytics, right, has been developed in the early 1800s. When I was 13, I worked at a computer store and processor that existed in 1993 selling computers to wheat farmers so they could dial into the internet using an ISP to get weather data, which predated the dial-up internet itself by 3 years. So farmers in wheat areas had dial-up for weather 3 years before everyone else had dial-up to access Juno or Netscape or whatever they were using, right?
yeah.
So it's always been a case where they're willing to invest. The misnomer comes from they're not willing to just spend money on frivolous things that don't provide a real value. It's a frugal industry. It's an industry that wants value right away and be able to prove it out. Nobody wants to do a lot of proof of concepts and science projects. Everyone will try to drone for free. Nobody's really going to pay for it unless you can prove an ROI and a substantial benefit. A lot of folks aren't just going to gamble and spend a bunch of money on what they know is going to work out, like another tractor. Labor, things are a lot more tangible. So you talk about advanced analytics or neural networks or innovation. I mean, makes for fun reading, but it has to have a practical ROI associated to it, or they're not going to buy it and just jump into it, right? They're not
Yeah.
early adopters for reasons. If they make a bad gamble that year, they could literally be betting the farm, right, on that idea. If I change my irrigation pattern because of an ML algorithm calculating my evapotranspiration and I get it wrong, my crops dry up, and then I'm out. I'm out, right? There's no plan B if I have a bad crop year,
Yeah.
uh, and concurrent bad crop years. So they absolutely will embrace technology wholeheartedly as long as it has a very tangible benefit. You're frankly not using, part of my French, BS to sell it, and it has something meaningful they can take away within a 1 or 2 crop years to know that it's a valuable thing. At the same time, they're willing to work with people, willing to solve problems, and willing to throw out use cases. Very collaborative community, folks willing to share what they know to see those problems solved because they know the issues they're facing. These are very smart people. A lot of them have PhDs from WSU and places in the agronomy space, right? Very smart scientific folks working very closely with WSU Ag School, right? Very strong intelligence in farming technology, being able to come side by side as a partnership, accepting that most technologists have no idea anything about farming, and that's okay. But being able to bring farmers along with the solutions they're developing to work on issues, not having arrogance in the space. There's a very famous example of an ag tech vendor coming to town with an automated apple picker that was looking to pick apples on 10-foot rows, and the farmer had 11-foot rows, and the tech company asked how hard it would be for the farmer to move the rows closer together. Those types of things create barriers to entry, right? Being able to understand the situation a farmer lives in every day, but work as a partner in two different spaces to solving problems together obviously benefits the farmer to adopt and leverage technology. Problem is now too many point solutions and too many individual problems being solved, not enough unification of tying all that data together in a simple enough interface, because the farmer's job is not to become a data scientist. They're interpreting data and making decisions. They also don't like science projects. So if you want to do something really cool with drones or really cool with lasers or Linux or whatever else, it has to have a very tangible benefit. And within a year or two, show how you're going to improve either lower costs and create efficiencies or improve yield and revenues. If it isn't tied to one of those two things, it's not going to be a whole lot of appetite for it.
So let's dive. That's great, Dan. Let's dive into an actual grower, if you don't mind. Can you share a little bit about what Loftus Ranches is about, and then maybe some of the early day insights to why Loftus Labs has kicked off? Because it's very aligned to what you've been sharing with us today, and very much aligned to kind of where the future is going. So I'd love to just have you explain a little bit more about what Loftus Ranches is, and then maybe we can parlay into the lab side of it.
Yeah, so Loftus Ranches, 100-year-old farm. The current CEO, Pat Smith, fourth generation farmer. Um, 19 been around since the 1920s, growing hops. Hops actually traditionally were a very unsophisticated crop, unsexy crop, because it was basically extract that went into beer generically. Hop industry really took off probably 12, 13 years ago with the craft brew industry really popping up, getting super interested in varieties of hops, flavors of hops. As the craft brew industry took off, certain varieties of hops became a lot more popular, proprietary varieties, things you could do to enhance the flavor of beer, which created a big boom within the hop industry. And Yakima, Washington is actually really the center of the hop universe. A large distributor in town, Yakima Chief Hops, which is owned by several growers in the area, including Loftus Ranches, is the largest distributor of American hops in the world. Our hops go into everything from Heineken beers to extracts to Coors Light to Sam Adams, Sierra Nevada, as well as local beers like Bellbreaker, which is also owned by the Smith family. So Pat Smith originally went to UW, came back after doing investment to help run the family farm, taking over from his dad, Mike Smith. Actually has a degree in data analytics from NYU. Knew the importance of technology early on, given his exposure to it. A lot of farmers coming back to run family farms in their mid 30s have experience in technology. A good friend of mine went to Stanford, got his MBA, worked at Apple in marketing, and now runs a family farm here down the road. Right, so a lot of folks going out and experiencing different things, bringing their expertise into ag. Pat's no different. So they've been using a database for the last 13 years, measuring everything that has to do with hops, and it shows up in the quality. They get a lot of awards for the quality of their hops because they're very data driven, leveraging new techniques around agriculture, looking to push the needle. I came on board in April to kind of supercharge that effort with all the work they had been doing around data, bringing a modern data stack to hop farming. We also own several acres of apples, peppers, hemp, a whole bunch of different crops. And as part of that process of bringing a modern data stack to Loftus, Pat and I really had a lot of great conversations around data-driven farming in a broader sense. And Loftus is certainly ahead of the pack in a lot of ways, but a lot of other farmers need help just as much as Loftus did. Even as being as far ahead as they were, there were still opportunities to bring modern data technologies to Loftus and really supercharge what they were already doing. And working side by side with our agronomists, who are all incredibly smart people in the hop growing, leveraging data to supercharge what we're growing, but in other farms that are further behind. In my experience working with farms that are struggling to stay in business, being able to leverage data and KPIs at a more fundamental level to keep them afloat, all the way down to the 50-acre farmer that has a couple weather sensors and doesn't know how to put that data to work. They can't afford a data team, a data person. There's not data teams forming Yakima. There's maybe 6 of us that come from a modern data background. I used to run a monthly AgTech meetup with about 70 people throughout the region showing up and talking about their data woes. You can't take a sysadmin overnight, make them a data person, and teach them advanced analytics. It just doesn't work. And yet farms, as I mentioned, ranging from the 50 acres up to the billions of dollars a year, all essentially need the same kind of help. I have a lot of data I'm generating. How do I put it to work? And I tell it best with the story of Texas in the 1800s. A lot of farmers, true story, had crops that were dying because oil was bubbling to the surface and killing the crops. Farmers thought it was a plague because they didn't know what oil was, how to put it to use. They disregarded it, and they ended up selling their land pennies on the dollar to people that didn't know what to do with it. Oil barons would literally go through farmlands in Texas, buy up land as a favor to the farmer, put that land to work, make 10,000x return because they knew how to do it. The term data is the new oil in much the same way as everyone's generating it and creating it. I don't know a single farmer that doesn't have Excel spreadsheets, data going back several years, generating all this information, IoT sensors out in the orchards, being able to hear about all these ag tech innovations around soil moisture and water and weather. But then they're stuck with all these different silos of pieces of information for packing houses, generating data, how to create efficiencies, lower labor costs. H2A labor is going up every year, prices of crops aren't. Supply chain, distribution, all the brokenness around just disparate types of information, processors, all generating data. But the companies that know how to properly leverage that information and put it to work, rise above the rest. And so we didn't think it was fair for any one company to have all the advantage around data. No one company can afford an entire data team, nor are there really enough of us to go around locally. So Pat and I got together months ago and decided to create a consulting company to work alongside each of those ag tech vendors, those point solutions, those creators of individual chunks of data, partners all over the community, be it out in the orchard, the back office, the packing house, the distributor, and create services to go alongside the hardware and software vendors to be able to create more of a unified model so multiple farmers could benefit from this, regardless of your crop type, regardless of your location. We aligned with a couple of really smart data scientists that Pat knew from NYU, and a handful of us are getting this off the ground over the last couple months, and look forward to having conversations with farmers regardless of their size. My big vision as we take this international to sustenance farmers growing 10 acres in Africa that literally are growing crops to live. A lot of people grow crops just to eat the crops because that's their food source. They need the same tools and solutions on how to manage our crazy climate environment right over the next 10 to 15 years. So the opportunity to start locally and expand out, there's no limits to how data and analytics analyzed and modeled in the right way can help farmers anywhere in the world. And that's really what Loftus Labs, coming from a 100-year-old farming tradition, now leveraging modern data technology, hopes to bring to people.
I'd like to touch on the data side of things, but sorry about that. Before we do, there was a couple of questions. Garrett, did you want to go next with your question?
Sure. Um, yeah, super interesting talk. Um, Basically, what we're doing is we're really interested in that last mile problem. So, how do you bring connectivity into orchards and things like that? Our theory is based on using the workers themselves and actually using the smartphone to capture Bluetooth data. So, Bluetooth from sensors. Um, I guess my question is, what type of connectivity are you seeing that's being needed? Is it basic comms, people with walkie-talkies, or is it things like capturing sensor data, things that can take hours or even days to pull the data from that sensor? So what types of connectivity or connectivity needs are you seeing in the agricultural environments?
I mean, it spans the gambit. Depending on the technology platforms I'm using, a lot of tech companies coming out in ag build a full stack solution, including a SIM card to provide cellular connectivity, assuming the farmer has no other connected options. Companies like Arable, for example, are building a kind of self-sustained solar powered cell-based weather stations that track 34 different metrics. If I'm using a mobile device on a Verizon phone, there might not be a whole lot of sophisticated uses outside of piece rate and tracking. If I'm in a cellular connected space, I'm going to be doing basic communications over Slack, Teams. We use Asana to be able to track different workflows. If it's a seasonal versus domestic workforce, they're going to have different connectivity needs. A lot of applications, sadly, are not bilingual, which, in my opinion, is pretty short-sighted in ag because bilingual is just a prerequisite for a lot of applications. So when it gets used, it's going to be used by someone that's more of a crew boss, a manager, someone that's in a fixed spot, checking people in and out from a timekeeping system. However, the opportunity to create devices in everyone's hands that they're putting to use, I envision when we talk about applications like augmented reality, where I hold up a phone to a tree and the tree turns red or green, depending on if it needs to get pruned or not, right? That assumes connectivity to grab data for the entire orchard, dial in the needs of that particular tree, and then send instructions to the individual that scans the tree, right? Perhaps using a QR code on the tree, feeding back into a system, and then relaying a color code requires a lot more connectivity. That's pretty far out use case, right? But it all is going to depend on the connectivity I already have today and what applications I use. But obviously, as I get more and more connectivity options, as my connectivity options grow and I'm no longer constrained by bandwidth, those types of bigger use cases become possible. But you can't go to a farmer in a spot that has spotty coverage, try selling them a solution like that, and then try to attach a big infrastructure bill, right? They're not all going to buy giant fixed wireless stations to provide a gigabit based bandwidth. They already have it great. There's opportunities to utilize it, but it's such a mishmash of options throughout the area that I find I end up as a CIO of a large apple grower, had to provide a lot of different kinds of solutions to different areas based on the connectivity being the largest constraint, right? Now, when Starlink rolls out 5G connectivity, that isn't a problem anymore. I see a whole range of options being created. There's experiments for things like TV white space, LoRaWAN, other pockets, but it's only as innovative as the farmer willing to either learn about it, try it out, install it, implement it, leverage it, right? Which is a lot of steps for any one grower to kind of take on and do themselves unless they have a full-blown IT team. So it's a bit of a long-winded answer to say it's a patchwork of options across the industry. There's no standard connectivity, and I'm seeing a whole bunch of different ways to try to solve it, from little like farm ear type ears being able to get a single station connected, to fixed wireless options, to places that are cellular connected, being able to just, push low cost devices out to workers of all kinds. But because it's so limited and so splotchy, we don't see broad sweeping adoption like we'd like to see in other industries that are connectivity is an afterthought. So still a long ways to go before there's a single answer for your question.
Well, speaking of connectivity, you had a question you wanted to ask.
Did you call on me? I didn't hear you.
Yeah.
Cut out for a second. Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Speaking of connectivity, yeah. Funny.
Hey, Lee.
Yeah. Hey, Dan. Good to see you. Yeah, I have a question. So you talk about rural connectivity and data aggregation visualization as a couple of the big challenges that are kind of blocking progress. For years, companies have been working on this area. There's tons of startups. Even if you go, my friend Michael, who's on my team and on this call, just looked at PitchBook. Even the last quarter, tons of startup funding in this area, in this arena. The core problem's not going anywhere. It's getting worse. Public-private funds are becoming more available. What is it going to take to tip the scale and see real progress in this area? Is it simply solving the connectivity issue? Is it solving that in data? Is it a platform issue? Is it just we need to wait 3 or 4 more years until more farmers become really technically savvy? Like what can these groups, like we have the IPZ, what can these groups do to help drive the tipping of that scale, and what are the key elements of that?
Yeah, so I think the largest impediment to connectivity was the same impediment to electricity, and that private companies do not see the financial incentive to wire up every part of the state. It doesn't pay the bills. If I'm in Mattawa, I have 40, maybe 50 SIM cards, and I'm going to set up a multi-million-dollar infrastructure project to set up a tower to cover what would equivalently be, 100 fields and maybe 10 homes. Electricity was created in the 1880s. It wasn't until 1945 that rural America had wiring. And it was because the REA, the Rural Electric Association, was created by the federal government to basically pay private companies to wire up rural America because nobody else really wanted to do it, right? And I'd hate to see that having to take place to fix this problem. I know the government, the FCC, the state, all trying to throw public funding at this thing. That the 5G Open Innovation Lab is saying is let's build these test beds, wire up a couple sites, build a business case, kind of prove to the telcos of the world there is money to be made here. It is not a fool's errand. It's not altruism. It's not a nonprofit effort. You're not going to throw away all this investment of money. You will make some money back, and in ways that will incentivize growers to leverage new technologies that require more connectivity, that drive more bandwidth spend, right? And if they're making money and cutting down on labor, they're spending it instead on their telcos. The telcos are making money, you get a faster ROI on those towers.
But let's say the telcos did become altruistic all of a sudden, and we decided to build a nationwide coverage for farms. What's the next issue holding this back?
It's really education. Once you take the impediment of connectivity away, all the farmers lining up to say, now what do we do with it, right? Because it's been such an issue for so long. You have an entire generation of farmers today actively farming that aren't used to what it's like to not worry about connectivity. So once that's taken away and it's no longer a barrier, it's like in the 1940s when the international or the interstate railroad or road system was paved, I think the Eisenhower Freeway Act. People suddenly went out and said, well, where can I drive to now that there's roads going everywhere, right? And you saw this huge boom of people going on road trips and trying out stuff and businesses popping up. But it largely starts with knowing where to go, how to get there. So groups like the AAA popped up, built maps, got advertisements out, educated people on how to do that. Once connectivity is no longer an issue and I have unlimited access to bandwidth to consider any number of options, educating growers on effectively what solutions to use to solve their labor issues first, their yield issues second, and then resource constraints third. And not necessarily blowing money on a bunch of science projects, like I said, but a cohesive stack of solutions that tie to real ROIs that within a year or two are going to produce meaningful returns, which gets me more money, keeps me privately held longer, which means I can now invest more in kind of more far out solutions, right? I can take commissions that exist across commodity types, take the money they're spending just to keep farmers afloat, and instead spend it on innovation and new ideas. But it's been a constraint for so long. Once it's no longer an issue, it will take a lot of education, time, and vigilance to be able to go out there and create a cohesive community and AgTech scene that's able to, leverage all that connectivity and bandwidth. But it is going to be educating the workers. It's going to be educating the farmers. It's going to be educating the vendors on how to take advantage of all that bandwidth because it's just never been there before. They will figure it out, but that's going to be the next thing to go after.
I think you're spot on, Dan. I think it's even bigger than that because even the ecosystem today that supports farming and ag tech, like let's take a John Deere as an example. They're creating capabilities in their machinery that has zero dependency on connectivity. And things could change if they had the access to the connectivity that generates, or rather takes the data that they're collecting off the machines and helps farmers become more efficient, whatever it is that they're doing. I mean, there's ramifications in the ecosystem that will open up the doors of new innovation to make its way through, when we have
Oh.
better connectivity. So on that point, there's a couple other questions that have come through. So I can't tell who's been asking the questions, and please feel free to speak up and ask your question. And then if we have time, Dan, I'd love to actually touch on a little bit of your consulting background at Slalom, because we had a conversation over a beer that kind of opened my eyes to really how important data is. And maybe there's some nuggets of insight you can share with the startups before we close. But if you have a question, please feel free to go ahead and ask.
I have a question if you guys don't mind.
Go for it.
So I know that the ag industry generates a lot of data over a large period of time constantly, right? So I'm sure that you have sensors generating data daily, weekly, monthly, or even per minute. How long does this data remain relevant once collected? And what's the kind of urgency that surrounds the analytics around this data? So if I'm generating data today, is there an urgency to process it right then and there? Or is there time and space to do so over, say, the next month or the next few weeks or something like that?
So I'd say the first answer, the data is relevant forever. And the reason is because agricultural trends over time in history means I'm able to track different events over periods of time. More importantly, because the weather, the earth, the soil is always changing, being able to look at periods of time when certain events occurred, such as smoke events, which are happening more often, but before would only happen ever so often. If I have a freeze on a given day, how does my crop respond within a given harvest? If a bad freeze happens on March 2nd, 2021, how many years do I have to go back to a year where that frost occurred on that day? And what was the impact to my crop at that time within that given variety? Because that data isn't necessarily there, a lot of folks aren't using it today. But if I hypothetically had all the data for 1,000 years and I'm able to go back and track trends, track weather, track soil, I can measure all the elements and then compare that to other periods of time that has similar impact compared to the crop that I'm using at that given point. And if I'm growing wine grapes, for example, the same vines over a 100-year period, and I had all the data in the world to use, I'd be a lot smarter about forward-looking forecasts and predictions if hypothetically all that data existed. So it lasts a very long time because I only have one harvest a year, and over several years, a lot of different things change. So tracking like variables to that period of time could be very useful. As far as urgency of the data goes, it depends on the data I'm collecting. If it's soil moisture data on a hot day, my moisture drops below a certain point. It's important to get water out to the crops pretty quick. I don't want to go 8 hours because then I got to play catch up over the next period of days, and I only have so much water that can leave a pump at a given time. If it's something around piece rates and labor, if I'm tracking it the next day retroactively and saying I should have paid adjusted rates within the day, having that information within an hour can be very critical. Other decisions, can span over a period of time, aren't as influential or don't matter as quickly. So being able to track yield information, obviously yield something I only track once a year, every year, but all the things that contribute to that, it's questionable. How much does any one variable have an impact versus looking at them overall? So it really just depends. Some data is very critical to have real time, if it's during harvest, tracking labor, impacting irrigation. Other decisions, other things I track, maybe not as impactful at that particular given point, but out of all those variables can be very impactful over the course of a year. But I've never heard of farmers throwing away data because it wasn't good anymore. It's more a question of saying, man, I wish I had tracked this data going back, 30 years to be able to get better trends.
That's probably even the case too, Dan, with global warming and some of the impacts of that on climate change and just traditional patterns of weather that span generations and generations changing so much. That data is now more critical than ever, probably, just in terms of helping to forecast what could be the future.
Right? Yeah, growing degree days is what we track around total heat, how much heat I'm getting every year. And we know in the last 10 years, growing degrees have been going up. Right. If I theoretically had that back 1,000 years, is this a 20-year trend? Is it a brand new trend? A lot of people still skeptical about global warming, but I'm also only have maybe 100 years worth of data. So I don't have a full warming cycle or cooling cycle to know how do I calibrate. And is all the doom and gloom really going to come to pass? It's going to hit agriculture before it hits anyone else. I mean, if we're talking about things getting really worse for the environment, it's going to hit your food before it hits your cities, right? All the more reason why ag needs help.
Got it. Any other questions? Yeah.
The one thing I would say, it seems like it could be a shift from being more of a craft to being more of a science, right? I'm sure science has played a role to some degree, quite a bit, but being able to have this data basically makes it more empirical and more defined than just hunches, which seems to be a lot of the way crafts are usually done.
Well, I'd say with farming, it's always applied scientifically, but only within the tools that I'm able to use, right? Any farmer that works the land over 30 to 50 years can intuitively know what's going to happen within a given parameter. When I get into outliers, when I get into new things, when I get into issues I haven't seen before, new kinds of pests or bugs, being able to have data to augment my expertise, right? Data, there's no risk of data ever replacing a farmer at all, but having new sets of inputs and tools to augment the decision making, what I call kind of decision support, there's always opportunities to enhance the data they're getting inputted on, right? So they can take their intuition combined with those inputs and make better decisions. So it's science within the tools I have, but we'd all agree if I'm performing science using Excel versus science using advanced analytics or modern data stack, still science, but a slightly more advanced version.
It also, to extend on that, it also seems like it also creates a better medium to share knowledge. So that way things can be, the more information that you have, it might be specific to that farm, but as you collect data and you get the outliers out of it, you can essentially apply it and share it easier so people can learn from it versus, I'm sure, once again, things are being shared and learned today, right? It's just all about magnitude and scale.
Yep, I have a vision of a company. If someone on the phone wants to back me on this idea and start a tech company, I'm all for it. I call the company Farmhand. And what it would be is a text-based app talking to my phone, talking to Alexa, and a farmer asking, hey, what should I be doing today? And it would go out and analyze all the data within a farm and give you a prioritized list. If I was you, I would do da 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 da, right? And it would prioritize using algorithms in the background, analyzing everything on their farm, but aggregating everything else within that region, all the other farms as well, right? And basically building benchmarks to say, you're doing fine within your farm. However, we're seeing trends here, here, and here in other parts that you need to start thinking about. So my decision making isn't hyper local within just my acreage or my farm or my plot. It's based on regional differences. It's based on weather coming from Canada. It's based on yield information from other groups. So I'm not necessarily calling out Joe down the road and his bad yield, but saying he got hit by this thing last year. It's going to affect me this year. I need to focus more on those decisions. But if I'm not talking to Joe because he grows wine grapes and I go tree fruit, we're not going to think there's an overlap, but boy, is there, right? Because it's maybe a pest that affects both types of trees. So if I had this farmhand tool told to me in plain English, as if I was actually speaking to a farmhand, leveraging all the advanced tools in the world on the back end using machine learning as the means to the end, but the end in itself, Alexa is helping me figure out what to prioritize on my farm, right? It's that commonly understood, easy to understand bilingual interface, not necessarily more technology, but describing all that data and information to me in a way that's easy for me to process, interpret, and apply, right? An interpretation layer sitting on top of all these advanced tools. So I'm not having to become a PhD to translate what my soil scientist is handing me in a lab result, and then apply that across all these different data sets such that every farmer benefits kind of collectively without any one farmer getting called out for bad farming decisions, right? Semi-anonymize it. I think that's really where a lot of this stuff becomes a lot more useful.
We're coming up the time. A couple of quick things. One is Dan is, as he mentioned, been helping us at the lab as a data scientist. He's actually opened up his time for all of you if you'd like to learn more about analytics and how big analytics are being used in enterprise and some of the engagements that he's done. We didn't have time to talk about that today, but guys, I encourage you to get some time with Dan. His email is dan@5goilab.com because he'd be really happy to help you with that. A lot of consulting engagements for which he really was part of driving transformational change at large enterprises was always rooted in data as the source of it. The second area was a point that Kurt had made on the chat, but we hadn't had a chance to bring it up, which is there's one thing to say, hey, we've got cellular connectivity now at a farm, but the use cases of that connectivity is beyond just chirpy IoT data and into much bigger data generating devices like drones or LiDAR cameras on ATVs going up and down rows. They're literally generating gigabytes worth of data in a small amount of time. And that data needs to go up and be processed and made sense of locally. So farming is physically a large operation. The connectivity piece is commensurate to that as well. Right, Dan, would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Being able to, like I said, take away the challenge of connectivity opens me up to being able to do a lot more interesting things, to interpret in real time based on the data I'm getting, to calibrate automated farming, reducing labor, putting those laborers to work, doing more effective things in technology. I mean, a vision around everyone making 16 bucks an hour, getting tech degrees or getting tech programs and boot camps, going back, becoming programmers, making 35, 50 bucks an hour, within rural communities, feeding it back to the farms. I'm not paying my manual labor more money to do the same thing. I'm upgrading their skills, teaching them technology. They're building me solutions. Now I can scale my farm. They're making more money. The community itself is a huge winner in that space. And in the center of that, ag is doing more and more advanced things to help scale farming. In the future, we're going to have to grow, I think it was 70% more crops on 40% less land. Global warming is wiping out arable land, it's wiping out water. So we have to get smarter about increasing more yield on less land, how I use water, how I adjust to temperature. And we have 10 years to do it. And it can't take a generation for farmers to figure this out. They know it, we know it. So it takes all of us on the call here building solutions to be able to solve those issues, or we're going to have much bigger problems than keeping rural America afloat, because that's what feeds us all.
Awesome. Well, Dan, we, no pun intended, cover a lot of this,
Yeah.
getting into understanding this industry and its dynamics. It's really fascinating and ultimately very important to our livelihood overall. As I mentioned, Dan is a friend of the lab. Reach out and have some chats with him. You'll be seeing and hearing a lot about or from Dan.
Yep, and I'm flashing my contact information here as well for everyone, just to get it on the recording. Reach out to me, Steve Mantle, another great way of doing it, and appreciate the time to share our story here.
Awesome. Well, with that, Dan, thank you so much. Have a good rest of your day, everybody, and thanks for listening in. We appreciate it, and we look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow. Cheers.